Who is the top running back in fantasy football this season? Are running backs overvalued in terms of their average draft position? How many running backs do I even need to have on my roster in order to win a fantasy football championship? We talk about all that and more in today's episode of Fantasy Football 201. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. This is Fantasy Football 201. It's an advice show on my channel geared towards fantasy football advice from a peer to you to help you win a fantasy football championship this year. So, if you're interested in this, please check out more of my channel. I've got a wide variety of content on fantasy football to include mock drafts. I just did one on Sunday. I've got strategy videos for quarterback and kicker. I've got team previews of every single team. And this is all to help you win a fantasy football title for this year, taking some advice that has worked for me in the past to be successful. I also talk about a wide variety of other stuff on my channel too, so if you're interested in that, please check it out in the description below. But in today's video, we're going to be talking about the running back position and the strategy that I would employ for running backs going into this season. I don't think I have to say too much with regards to running back importance because running backs is well known to be one of the most important positions in fantasy football and one of the most valuable ones to have, especially at the top of the draft. But there are some key takeaways from the running back position that a lot of people forget about that I want to highlight in this video, particularly the importance of having depth and the importance of having flexibility at the running back position. So we look at the years past. I've been doing this with the kicker and quarterback going back 3 years. The players that were at the top of the running back draft boards in terms of average draft position going into that season. 2018, David Johnson was the number 2 average draft position player at running back. Todd Gurley was number 1. But David Johnson in particular had a very disappointing season in 2018 going into 2019 in terms of how he performed. 2019, the number 1 overall player taken in that year's draft was universally Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley also had a relatively disappointing year in 2019 as he battled injuries and did not perform up to levels of expectations. In 2020, last season, Christian McCaffrey was going into the season as the, again, almost unanimously number 1 picked player in terms of average draft position. But he battled many injuries as well and had a very disappointing 2020 campaign. So now we go into 2021, and my takeaway with going through all those examples is saying that running backs have a lot of uncertainty in terms of dealing with injuries, in terms of how they will actually perform. Running backs are, of all the positions that you're playing in fantasy football, they are the most often injured. And you want to make sure that you have a lot of options on your team, not only to backfill yourself in case one of your top players gets hurt, but also just to give you some options for trade chips as well. So I will get into that throughout the video too. Running backs, they are the most oft injured, and I'd use the guys at the top of the draft board as an example of this for that particular example. But if you go through draft board, if you go through teams' stats and how often their starting running back changed and how many times they had to change running backs because of an injury, you find that there were not a lot of running backs that actually played the full 16 games generally throughout the course of a season. So all that being said is that teams have to adjust to have backup running backs that can step up in case their starting running backs get injured, and you need to do the same as a fantasy football manager. It's very important that you have a lot of options to fill your running back positions, because if you wait and try to pick them up on waivers rather than picking them up in the draft, then you will lose out on a lot of these options that other managers have already picked up. So for example, I talk handcuffs a little bit. I'm going to get into a little bit more with running backs, but handcuffs, if you're not familiar with that, are the number 1 backup running back for an elite running back who has RB1 level production. So the backup running back, or the handcuffed, is somebody that's still very valuable because you can hold them as their backup, and if anything were to happen to the starter, then your backup instantly becomes an RB1 level candidate. So what are some example guys of this? You have Chuba Hubbard for Carolina, the backup to Christian McCaffrey. You have Alexander Madison, the backup for Dalvin Cook in Minnesota. You have Darrington Evans for Tennessee. He is a handcuff for Derrick Henry. You've got Tony Pollard, a handcuff for Zeke Elliott. Guys like that. And these players have significant value to you because if they get injured, if the starters get injured, then you will have RB1 level production. But then they're also valuable to the owner of the starter because they're not going to want to run the risk of one of their starter going down and then not having a contingency plan within that system. So you can still get a lot of value out of those players if you were to trade the handcuff to the owner of the starter. So they're very important, and it's just another example of guys that you want to add in terms of depth on your team. It's extremely important because injuries are going to happen, and you want to make sure that you're planning ahead on this stuff in the draft when you can initially get these players rather than waiting until your top running back goes down and you only have one running back on the bench, because you really do not have a lot of options to try to remedy your running back core at that point. We will show this in more detail on the average draft position chart in a minute. But the other thing that I want to highlight in terms of running backs and why I think that in terms of having flexibility and depth, it's important. But the other point I want to bring up too is that you want to be careful that you're not overreaching for running backs given the need of and desire to have an elite level running back. So naturally what happens is because running backs, there's only a few elite running backs, and you want to make sure that you lock up a solid RB1 to help you in the fantasy football season. But what ends up happening is that there is a significant level of overdrafting for these running backs, making sure that you get the guys that you want on your team, and people are gonna go off the board early because of the high demand for running backs. But what you want to make sure is that in those middle rounds, 3 to 5, that you are not reaching for running backs that will not be of much value to you and are probably going to be overdrafted. So example candidates of that for this season. For me, Miles Sanders is definitely a candidate for that. Philadelphia is kind of a shaky running back core. Their offense is going to be relatively questionable to begin with, and Miles Sanders has not consistently proven that he is a elite level running back yet. Other players to keep in mind that will probably fall into this category too is Myles Gaskin for Miami. So because Miami, people are taking Myles Gaskin relatively high because Miami needs a running back, but is Myles Gaskin going to be the guy because he hasn't consistently held a backfield yet? These are some examples of players like that could potentially be reached for, and I'm going to go through examples of that with the average draft position chart in a minute. But what you want to make, the reason that I bring this up is that a lot of people will make the mistake of overdrafting for running backs to try to fill their running back core, but then they neglect having elite receivers that they can lock in every week. And I'm going to get into more specifics on the receivers in their own separate video, but with wide receivers, they are not as injured as often as running backs. So with wide receivers, if you have an elite wide receiver, and especially if you can get 2 or 3 elite wide receivers, it is so valuable in fantasy football to consistently have a wide receiver 1 and 2 that you can just lock and load every week, no hesitation. They can put up consistent stats for you, and then your focus is primarily staying on top of the running back game the rest of the way. Because running backs, the landscape is going to change throughout the season in ways that can benefit you if you're savvy. But for wide receivers, it's very hard to do this. And the reason being is because if you think about it, a team on average has 3 wide receivers that they will generally involve consistently in a game. So if one goes down of those 3, then there's still 2 other of those guys before. So it's very difficult in terms of wide receivers to fill in the gaps for having a weak wide receiver core because there's just simply not going to be as many avenues mid-season to remedy that. But if you lock in great receivers early in the draft and get guys that you can put in and you don't really have to worry about it the rest of the season, then you can focus on getting running backs throughout the season because the landscape of running backs is going to allow you to do that based on the nature of injuries. So it's not talked about much, but I think it's very understated just in terms of the value that receivers have because of the stability that they're more likely to get. So we'll take a look at this in more detail through the average draft position chart from 2020. So we have this displayed here in the attached. So we start at number one. The number one average draft position player, as I mentioned, was Christian McCaffrey. He only played 3 games last season because he battled injury. The number 2 player was Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley also had an injury in week 2, was out for the season, very underperforming. Zeke Elliott, number 3. Zeke was also relatively underperforming as well compared to his standards from years past. Tony Pollard had a much bigger role. Guys that drafted Zeke Elliott and the average 3rd pick in the draft were probably disappointed with his output. The next up that we have is Alvin Kamara. So Alvin Kamara was actually one of the few that did play very well in relative to his average draft position. He was the number 1 PPR running back last season, gave you pretty good value. Other players of note, so Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he overperformed his average draft position. Dalvin Cook, same, overperformed his average draft position as being the number 6 pick on average. Derrick Henry overperformed. Josh Jacobs, right about the same. Austin Eckler was a sleeper from last season, but he only played 10 games with injury, so a little bit disappointing, but still played well when he did play. Miles Sanders right there. Again, I talked about him being disappointed. Joe Mixon only played in 6 games. And then the number 12 pick that we have displayed here is Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake, I think he was decent, but he was not worth the top half of the 2nd round. And then Nick Chubb we have here as somebody who overperformed his draft position. So I bring this up is because the average draft position and where these running backs are getting taken according to the draft board is not going to match up to how they're performing in the regular season. And if you notice, it's a little bit of a crapshoot in terms of which running backs played well and which ones didn't. And the most common denominator for the ones who didn't was because they battled injuries and were not available. So all that being said, you're going to have changes in the running backfield, and it's more important that you get depth to that and give yourself some guys later on in the draft that could be helpful to you. Because you put all your stock, let's say that last season you drafted Joe Mixon instead of taking somebody like DeAndre Hopkins. That would have been a very bad pick because DeAndre Hopkins is a very consistent receiver last season. And if you're trying to get elite running backfield of, let's say you had Derrick Henry and then you get Joe Mixon, you lost out on some real opportunity to lock in a great receiver there. You will look at some other running backs later on that did particularly well last season that were available later on. One of the ones that stands out to me, Kareem Hunt was average available as in the 5th round last season. He was a top 10 running back. David Montgomery was a top 5 running back who was available generally at the end of the 5th round. And then James Robinson was another excellent example of a guy who placed top 10 last season, but was generally undrafted because at the time, Leonard Fournette was still questionable of whether or not he was going to be on the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then when he got cut, everybody took Raquel Armistead. But Armistead battled COVID as well as some other injury issues and never played last season. So it's an example of how constantly monitor these teams' running back situations throughout the season. Pick them up early in advance. If you've got a lot of space for running backs on your bench, you'll be able to do this. And you will set yourself up to be successful, even if you don't necessarily take one of these guys that's drafted very highly, because you've done your legwork to give yourself the depth and allow guys to step up once the landscape has changed in your favor. And you'll be surprised when you commit to this, you will have a lot of opportunities open up for you if you're being savvy and you're picking up these guys in advance. So now we'll go into the strategy that I employ. And generally for my strategy, what I try to do for running backs is within those first 2 rounds, I try to get an RB1. I don't necessarily commit to one round or the other, but what I generally will try to do is see if I can get at least one great RB1 either in the first round or the second round, so I can have a guy that I can count upon as an elite running back. And then for that RB2 position, if I get a guy later on in the fourth, fifth, etc. round, I will try to fill that. But generally, what I want to try to do is get a elite pass catcher, and ideally two wide receivers, but tight ends. Maybe I'll get into that a little bit later as well. You could maybe if you got Travis Kelce or George Kittle, I would consider taking them third round. But basically, my focus is not on trying to get all running backs early. I try to get a running back in one of the top 2 rounds, and then my focus is trying to get some pass catchers and then try to get some running backs later on, because reaching for running backs over taking great receivers is a mistake in my opinion. And ideally, I'm going to want at least 6 running backs on my team. You don't want to ever end up in a situation where you have 4 running backs or less, because there's going to be different matchups that dictate which running backs will be successful in which games. Again, injuries happen, changes to your backfield happen. So it's better to be short on wide receivers if you have a few good ones than to be short on running backs. And collect as many running backs as you can, because the landscape will change as the season goes along. So that being said, I now present my top 10 running backs relative to where they're drafted that I would consider taking as an RB1. Number 1, I have in a separate tier of tier 1 guys that I have on the top of my board in this order: Christian McCaffrey number 1, Dalvin Cook number 2, Alvin Kamara number 3, Derrick Henry number 4. So I've talked about these guys in varying degrees, but generally I like McCaffrey, Cook, and Kamara because of their PPR value that they can provide in addition to their performance. But they are all focal points of the offense. They are all get a lot of involvement. A lot of people are down on Kamara because of the transition to either Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill, depending on who starts. But that's not very concerning to me, because I think, especially with Michael Thomas being out, Kamara is going to be the best player on offense. They're going to try to get him involved. And Sean Payton is a smart coach, and he will be able to do that. Derrick Henry I have at number 4. The only reason I don't have him top 3 is because he's not as much a threat in PPR situations, but he's just such a monster at pounding the ball down the field in terms of a standard value that he has to go in the top 4, in my opinion. Then you get into this, after you get those 4 running backs, you could potentially consider Devontae Adams, Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, depending on the situation. But then we get to the next set of running backs that I like. At number 5, Saquon Barkley. Number 6, Austin Eckler. Number 7, Aaron Jones. And number 8, Nick Chubb. So these are all running backs that I really like that you can get in the late first round, potentially. And I rank them in that order with a little bit of leeway, either depending on because personal preference. I don't think there's a ton of difference between these guys necessarily in terms of who I think will be great and not great. I put Chubb at the bottom because he's going to split some carries with Kareem Hunt. But these are all guys that I am very high on, and I think they are available. If you can get them in the late first round, I think that's very good value for you to have as an elite RB1. And then 2 other guys that I think will probably be available more in the second round, but I think are still great value for you to have as your RB1 are Najee Harris and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So those are all the guys that I really like the most in terms of players that you can pick up. That's my top 10 ranking in terms of running backs that you can get off the board relative to their position. So you wonder why I may not have Zeke Elliott or Jonathan Taylor. And the reason I do that is because they are guys that will probably be... So if you got a choice between Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Zeke Elliott, I think there's an argument to be made you take Zeke Elliott. But for me personally, I know that Zeke Elliott will go in the first round, and among the guys that he could go up against, I am not high on Zeke Elliott, so I would personally, in my case, avoid him. And he almost never would fall to me to the point that I would even consider him. Same with Jonathan Taylor. Both those guys I have legitimate questions about. You can go back to my previous videos where I did team reviews where I talk about them in more detail. But guys that I do not have included around this range that would be going there are guys that I have similar questions about as well. So now we go to the average draft position of guys that will be available later on. We start with Josh Jacobs, who is projected to be available around the third round, and then we go all the way down to Darrell Henderson at RB30. So guys that stand out to me here that are of good value. David Montgomery is good value, not only because he performed well last season, but because he is going into a situation where he's expected to have better quarterback play that'll potentially get him more involved. Also, depending on when they when they move over to Justin Fields, it's expected that they will probably rely a little more on their running backs because they're working with a rookie quarterback. David Montgomery is available for pretty good value considering how he performed last season. Other guys I like, Kareem Hunt is very good value to me here at RB number 21 because he is in a great offense where he's going to get opportunity. Was still top 5 finisher last year, but if anything happens to Nick Chubb, then this guy is immediately top 5 potential level running back. Other players that I like around this range, so there's potential in guys like Javonte Williams to step up in Denver. I'm not exactly sure when and if he'll be able to do that this season, but he is good value for you to have because of his upside. Other players I like, Travis Etienne here. He's got some good value with Jacksonville, but again, it's going to be a little concerning between how him and James Robinson go. But guys here that I would definitely be cautious about for being overreached are, as I mentioned earlier, Miles Sanders, DeAndre Swift, Myles Gaskin, Raheem Mostert, because San Francisco, to me, always runs a running back committee. I would be very careful about reaching for him. Mike Davis, I think he will eventually lose his job at some point to a younger running back with more upside. And then Darrell Henderson, I think, is another guy who could potentially be reached for because I think more than likely the Rams will run a committee backfield. In the next ADP chart, we move to guys that are going to be available more in the middle range, and we start getting into some handcuff options that are of interest. So guys that I want to talk about that I like and guys that I don't like. So Ronald Jones, I actually really like him. I think that he's being slept on. A lot of people are taking Leonard Fournette over Ronald Jones, but I think Ronald Jones, one, has more upside, and two, was the more consistent performer throughout the season. I know he struggled in the postseason, but Ronald Jones still played very well and played better than Fournette for the most part throughout the majority of the season. Other guys that I like, you've got potential in a guy like Michael Carter. I don't know what New York's offense is going to look like, but it's trending in the direction that he will become the starting running back sooner rather than later. Other guys of interest to me, Zach Moss in Buffalo, he's going to have opportunity. I think he's got a lot of potential, but kind of never really took off with it last year because he battled injuries from time to time. Other guys that are very interesting handcuffs with some upside potential are Trey Sermon and A.J. Dillon. Trey Sermon is more of a temporary handcuff. I think he will eventually fulfill a starting position for San Francisco as the season goes along. But A.J. Dillon is a great example of a handcuff to Aaron Jones. Other guys that are also on this list here, you've got Tony Pollard. He's an excellent handcuff to own. Latavius Murray has done well when it's only been him as the lead running back in games where Kamara has been hurt in the past. And then other players to keep in mind that are also good value as more of a floor player is Nyheim Hines. Very good PPR option to have. Not somebody that you can rely upon to have a breakout game, but a consistent player that you can count on if you're in a pinch. And now we move to the next tier of players, which is expected to be later in the draft and available for you to pick at some of your last picks. And this is why I prioritize a lot of running backs, because a lot of these guys will be available and they have some great handcuff value. Alexander Mattison, a great handcuff to have for Dalvin Cook. I already talked about him. J.D. McKissick is kind of like a poor man's version of Nyheim Hines to a degree. Very good PPR player. Suspected to have a little less involvement than Hines, but he's still very interesting to me as a guy you can get late. There's some other great handcuff options here as well, like Chuba Hubbard. I talked about him a little bit. I haven't talked about Rashad Penny a lot, but I think he could have some upside depending on what the Seattle backfield looks like. He is a former first-round pick, although he hasn't exactly shown much so far. You've got Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland are both interesting options in case anything happens to Najee Harris. Not pictured here as well, Darrington Evans. I've already talked about him a little bit. And these are some great players that you could keep in mind as that you can get later in the draft that could be of some excellent value to you. And I think when you're in a deep league like this, you want to make sure that you have a couple of these guys available to you as backup options. And especially if you took one of the top 4 running backs that I talked about, you have to make sure that you take their handcuff, especially later in the draft or when they start coming up on the board, because you do not want to put yourself in a situation where you do not have the handcuff to one of those elite running backs if they do get hurt. So that is all I've got on the running backs for this video. Very long one, but I think there's a lot of interesting takeaways to have in terms of running backs that are important for you to know. So let me know what you think of this video, and if you're interested, please consider checking out more of my channel. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.